Michael, you've taken my clicker. I should just remind everyone that this is quite heavy. There's a lot of presentations by experts on the background to this, but there's going to be time for discussion directly after this and as the weekend unfolds, so just bear with us. For those of you who were here last night, of course, you had the possibility of using Michael's single transferable vote to pick the dessert for next June. So the 3 desserts that we're going to have to eat are as a result of a single transferable vote election. And I'm very grateful for the participants for picking a couple of chocolate options there. But the object of this weekend and the next meeting in June, effectively, in terms of the brief that we've been given, is to decide about the Dáil electoral system. And basically, as a convention, what you'll be asked to decide between ultimately is, do we keep the existing electoral system as it is? Do we keep the existing electoral system but make changes to it, which would be a second option, which we're going to come to later on? Or thirdly, which is the object of my presentation, if we were going to completely change and get rid of PRSTV, what would be an alternative electoral system? And that's the object of my 20-minute spiel. So you've already been hearing a lot about the different kinds of electoral systems that are out there and that they break down into these 2 main types, proportional and non-proportional. And I thought just to try and take away some of the, to try and give you some practical examples of it. Here's an illustration from 2 elections that happened almost at the same time in 1983. Britain, as we know, uses, as you'll be hearing a bit more in a minute from me, the Firstpastthepost system, a non-proportional system, and they used it in their election, the general election in 1983. And Germany uses a proportional system. Same year they had their election. So you see in the blue box there, what's known today as the Liberal Democrats. This was a precursor party, the SDP Liberal Alliance. They got a quarter of the vote, 25% of the vote. A quarter of the people of Britain voted for them. Yet they ended up with just 3.5% of all the seats in the House of Commons. And you can see at the top there, the Conservatives, with 42% of people voting for them, ended up with a huge majority, 61% of all the seats in the House of Commons. And that's what you get in a non-proportional system. The object is not to worry about the fair balance between votes and seats. Usually the focus is on trying to get one big party to win an overall majority. Same year, a few months later, the German election, the equivalent of the SDP Liberal Alliance, the Free Democrats, they only got 7% of the vote. They got a tiny vote in comparison to their British counterparts. Yet they got almost exactly the same amount of seats. And that's what you get in a fully proportional system. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the choices before us. Do we want to keep a system along the lines that we've already got, which is proportional, or do we want, and if so, do we want to consider options within that, or do we want to move to a non-proportional system? And basically what you've been hearing from Michael in terms of the single transferable vote, as he said, apart from Ireland and Malta, there are very few places that use it. Well, my job is to try and talk about a number of the main obvious alternatives that you'd be deciding. We're dealing with between 80 and 90 established democracies in the world, and in truth, every single one has its own electoral system. So we could be here till the cows come home and beyond, talking about all the different weird and wonderful options out there. But to make life bearable for you, we're just going to focus on the obvious alternatives. And as you can see, in terms of FPTP, Firstpastthepost, the British system, it's the most used in terms of population in the world. That's because of India. So India, the United States, Canada, a lot of big democracies use that system. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the list system is the most used in terms of the number of countries. Almost all European democracies, for example, use the list system. So they're the 2 most popular systems. Then I'll deal with MMP, which is the German system. So let me deal with them. But basically, these are the 3 options. You've already had the briefing documents. You've got brief summaries as well on the table in front of you. And some of us have used some of these systems to pick the starters and the mains for next June's meeting also last night. So I'm going to start with the non-proportional electoral systems. And they come in 2 main types. The British Firstpastthepost, which, as you've seen, is also used in Canada, the United States, and India, among other big countries. And then the alternative vote, which is sometimes, as I think it was Michael Marsh was talking about, in this country is referred to as single seat, single transferable vote. We use it, the alternative vote, we use that to elect the president. So Michael D. Higgins was elected using that system. And we also use it in by-elections. So these are the 2 main types of non-proportional electoral systems that I want to take you through. And the defining feature of that these systems, these non-proportional systems share in common is single seats. So you're electing one Dáil deputy. You would have a smaller geographical constituency, and each constituency would only be electing one Dáil deputy. So very different from what we've got at present. So in terms of what that means in terms of the ballot paper, over on your left you've got a Firstpastthepost ballot paper, which I stole from my... I used to live in England, and Manchester Central was my constituency, and the Labour candidate Tony Lloyd was guaranteed to win. I mean, if Labour put a monkey up in a safe seat, the monkey would win, and equally for the other parties. That's what you get if you're in a certain kind of single-seat constituency, which is has a predominant voting population in favour of one party. That party is going to win, and it's a wasted vote if you're not supporting that party. Well, I stole the ballot paper so I could have the nice slide to show you. But basically, as we used last night to pick our Caesar salad starter, apologies, we're all going to have a Caesar salad starter in June. You have one choice, just an X against whichever candidate you want. Whereas in the case of the alternative vote, it looks a bit more familiar. You're told you can rank order 1 to 5 the candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is, as I said, the system that we use to elect Michael D. Higgins. So let me take you through how the counting goes in each of these cases. So first of all, in the Firstpastthepost system, the object is who gets Firstpastthepost, who gets the most votes. So here's an extreme example, the poor voters of Inverness, Nairn and Lochaber in 1992. And just look at those votes. So this is why we end up with Caesar salad in June. This is the sort of thing that you'll end up with. Russell Johnson, the Liberal Democrat, gets 26% of the vote. The next person, the Labour candidate, gets 25%, and then the SNP candidate gets just under 25%. The winner is Russell Johnson. He wins by 458 votes. He has barely 25% of the support of that constituency. So 75% of the voters in that constituency are stuck with Russell Johnson, whether they like him or not, as the only person they can go to for their representation. So if they're not Liberal Democrat supporters, tough. That's the result they ended up with in a very narrow election. That's the way it goes in the most extreme example. So look at alternative vote. It's quite different, because here you're not just looking for a plurality result, not who has the most votes. The winner must have an overall majority, must have at least 51% of the vote. So here's an example from a presidential election that is probably the most pertinent one to use. The election of Mary Robinson in 1990 as the Irish president. So the quota, it's the same kind of thing that Michael Gallagher was talking about a minute ago. You have a quota to pass, which is effectively 50% plus 1 of the total number of votes, in this case in the whole of the Irish Republic. And the quota was 787,326 votes. So in the first count, Mary Robinson is beaten by Brian Lenihan of Fianna Fáil. So if we were using the system you were just looking at a minute ago, the one that elected our colleague in Inverness, Nairn and Lochaber, that would have been the end of the election, and Brian Lenihan would have been president. That's Firstpastthepost. He has more votes than anyone else, end of the election. But because we use the alternative vote like Australia, and nobody has an overall majority, they now have to transfer the votes of the weakest candidate, Austin Curry, transfer and look at the next preferences on Austin Curry's ballot papers, and lo and behold, Mary Robinson is deemed the winner. She got more of the number 2 votes because she got an overall majority. She passed the quota. So that you can see already is quite a big difference from Firstpastthepost. And so briefly, in terms of the outcomes, just to sort of start raising issues that we'll be hearing more about later on. These non-proportional electoral systems, what they sort of share in common, you've got smaller constituencies, you've got less candidate competition because it's just one candidate who's going to win, so one candidate from each party. You've got a huge amount of wasted votes. You've got a lot of very annoyed people, particularly in safe seats, thinking, what's the point? I'm short of selling my house and moving to another part of the country, I'm never going to get the MP for the party I want. It's unfair on smaller parties because it's not there to help smaller parties. It's there to make sure the big parties win as many seats as possible. So you'll have a lot less small parties, and you'll have a lot less women TDs with that system. And all the figures show that. So moving on quickly, I've got 2 more systems to take you through. The proportional list systems. This is about as different as you can get in many ways, as you'll see, not in all ways, from what we have here. So this is a proportional system. It's like our system in the sense that you're now trying to produce a relatively fair outcome, whatever proportion of votes a party gets, you should get a sort of rough equivalence in terms of the proportion of seats they end up with. In terms of the constituencies, they often refer to them as regions rather than constituencies, but it's the same thing. It varies. So the smallest you'll find in some countries, I think Spain is the example here, I'm not quite remember, it might only be 5 seats, it might only be 5 members of parliament in one region, whereas it can be as many as 24. It can be really large regions in some countries. And the most extreme example is the Netherlands, where the entire country is one constituency. So there's 150 members of parliament in the Netherlands, and they're elected for the whole of the Netherlands. There's no constituencies whatsoever. So it's quite different already from what we're used to. Oops, it's gone too quickly. And then in terms of the ballot papers, so on your left, you've got basically two main types, as you'll see in the briefing document, of list systems, the closed list and the open list, and there's variance in between these two extremes. So the closed list, here's a South African ballot paper, but they use it in Spain, they use it in Portugal, they use it in a number of other countries. It looks like our ballot paper, doesn't it? But you have pictures there. But those are the photographs of the party leaders. So an Irish equivalent would be pictures of Enda Kenny, Micheál Martin, Gerry Adams, and so on. And all you as a voter are doing is you're voting for, you're putting an X in the box next to your preferred party in the closed list system. And then it depends on what order the candidates have been listed by the party that determines who gets elected. So now if you're a prospective candidate, your focus is on trying to make sure you're put as high in the list as possible. So your focus is on what's going on inside your party rather than what's going on inside the constituency. The other extreme is Luxembourg, where you can take that option like you have in South Africa and just say you're only going to vote for the party of your choice, so you tick the little black box at the top there, or you can vote preferentially for all of the for candidates from all of the parties. In other words, in the Luxembourg version of list, you can more or less do what we can do with a single transferable vote. So the options that have been presented for you here are: do you go for a closed list type of system, which is extremely different, and the parties determine the rank ordering of the candidates, or do you go for a very open version of list, which is more or less what we have already? It's just a variant of what we got already. Outcomes. Counting the votes. I don't have the time to go into it in any detail, but here's the gist of it. So let's imagine Party A, Fine Gael, receives 30% of the vote, and there are 10 members of Parliament, 10 Dáil deputies to be allocated. Well, the idea of the system is that if they get 30% of the vote and there's 10 seats to be allocated, then 30% of 10 seats is 3 seats. So they have to allocate the 3 seats. Well, in a closed list system, what we would do is we would go to the list of candidates that Fine Gael will have drawn up, and the top 3 candidates are elected. That's it, end of story. The only way the voter could change that would be to join Fine Gael and get involved in the candidate selection process to try and get their preferred candidate up. But the voter can't do that. Whereas in the open list, the sort of Luxembourg example, and in other kinds of open lists, to varying degrees, voters can influence the rank ordering of candidates. But as I said, eventually you come to a system that's very like our own, so it's not a huge difference. In terms of outcomes, you're going to end up with much larger constituencies. It might be whole regions, for example. And in the case of closed list systems, you'll end up with much less constituency service. So what you'll find actually in a lot of countries that have closed list systems is that in debates like we're having today, they're actually looking at our system. They're looking at systems where there is more constituency service than they're used to. So they find the sort of thing we've got more appealing. Party-based, there's much more party control over who gets elected than we're used to. And then fair outcome for small parties. This would be Michael Marsh's dream, I suppose, in some ways, because you'd end up with no independents, because by definition an independent isn't a member of a party, and therefore there isn't a party list for an independent. And you'd end up with a good gender representation, so that's certainly a plus. Finally then, mixed member proportional systems. This is the German system. This was a system that only Germany operated for a very long time, but it's become a little bit more fashionable of late. There are more countries that use it, and New Zealand would be a very good example. They adopted it in the early 1990s. And essentially, as you can see, what it is, it's a mix of the British Firstpastthepost and the list system you've just seen. That's why it's called a mixed member. It's mixing the two systems in one. So therefore, you get two different types of constituencies, if you like. You get a lot of single-seat constituencies. So in Germany, 50% of the members of the parliament, of the Bundestag, represent single-seat constituencies, and 50% of them represent regional lists. In New Zealand, that second 50% represents the entire country. But you don't have to have 50-50. You can have variations there. And you could have all sorts of variations. Some of the commentators who've been talking about this system as a possibility for Ireland have talked about whether you could mix our system with a list system. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful combinations one could consider. In terms of voting, here's a New Zealand ballot paper. And basically, you can see it on the ballot paper, it's divided into two parts. So you have two votes. One for, on the left-hand side, you're voting for the party of your choice, a closed list. So you can see the red banner at the top there is the Labour Party. So if you're a Labour supporter, you X the box next to the Labour Party, and then the rank order that's been established for the candidates by the Labour Party are elected from the top down. And then you can vote on the other sides, and you can see there are a whole bunch of candidates. There's including a Labour candidate there at the top. But you don't have to vote Labour both times. You can change your vote. So you can vote for a Labour list, and you could vote for, I can't see from this distance, but a candidate from another party to represent your constituency. So as you can see, it's a mix of these two systems. The counting of votes can get quite involved, but here's the gist of it. So the counting takes 3 stages. First of all, much like in a British election system, you count the constituency votes to determine who's won the constituency seat. So just like Inverness, Nairn and Lochaber and the election of Sir Stewart or whatever his name was, whoever has the plurality of the vote wins the constituency seat. So the returning officers do all that, and then they put those results to one side. And then the second stage of the count is they look at the list votes. And the list vote is to determine how many seats each party should be awarded overall. And once they've determined that, then the third stage is to subtract the constituency seat total from the list seat total. So let's say, for example, the Labour Party, on the basis of the list vote, are going to win 30 seats overall in this example. But they've already won 10 constituency seats. Then you subtract the 10 constituency seats from the 30 seats, and the remaining 20 seats are the list seats that they're awarded. And that produces a proportional result. So in terms of outcomes, my last slide, you've got a lot of the outcomes that are familiar from the previous 2 electoral systems. So you've got single-seat constituencies, so you have this constituency link element. This is why a lot of people support this kind of system. Because it's proportional, you also have results that are good in terms of fairness to small parties and also good gender balance. And you have independents creeping through, because the independents can pick up constituency seats. They won't get list seats, but they'll get constituency seats. And that's why very often this is referred to as the best of both worlds. This sort of system has a lot of supporters, and a lot of commentators, as Michael Marsh was talking about earlier on, have talked about variants of this system for Ireland. And basically why they're saying it is because it's wonderful, isn't it? We're going to have 2 types of TDs. We're going to have the constituency TD who'll do all the things that we love from our constituency TDs, and then we're going to have these national figures who are going to do weird and wonderful things because they are elitist experts, and they have all the expertise that they can bring to bear in terms of the needs for good parliamentary debate. Isn't that great? And it does sound wonderful. It's very tempting. But I just add warning notes. There's a ... there. First of all, here's an example. Large parties end up with most of the constituency seats. This happened in Wales. Wales uses this system for its Welsh Assembly. That you had the Labour Party did extremely well, the British Labour Party, in the Welsh Assembly election, the very first one. They did so well that they didn't get any list seats. So they got all the constituency seats, which meant that then when they go into power, all they had were constituency politicians. They didn't have any list politicians. So that's the sort of thing you can get. You may not get the second type of TD that you're looking for. But secondly, they don't necessarily operate differently, because just think of the logic here. You have the type of TD who represents a constituency. So therefore, there needs to be support to make sure that TD has a constituency office and constituency staff and a groundwork on the constituency to operate their office very well. And then you've got these other kind of TDs who are the list TDs. Well, they don't need that. This is the argument, because they're list TDs. They don't need a constituency office. So they don't need those resources. So you got them looking at the other ones thinking, well, hold on, these guys have an advantage over me because they have all those resources I don't want. And furthermore, this person with his own office or her own office can go around and chase as many votes as they want to try and make sure they get elected next time. Whereas my job is to make sure Enda still likes me at the end of the day, because otherwise I'm going to go to the bottom of the list. So I'm not nearly as comfortable as that person. I want to be that person. So why don't I just do the same job that he's doing? And before you know it, you've got TDs chasing each other, doing much as they're doing right now, but with the added little impetus that this one feels kind of, badly done by and wants to be that one. So you have another version of what we got already. That's the warning note I'd add. So there's your three systems in a very short nutshell. And one possibility would be, and that's a vote for you to decide on tomorrow, is that if any one of those three systems potentially interest you as one to look further at, that we would work up in much more detail how one of those systems could operate in an Irish context and discuss it in more detail in June. But I'll stop there. Thank you.